Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It is such an honor to be back in Oxford. I don't know if you guys know, but I spent nearly 14 years of my life in this country and had a great many friends that were studying here and so many incredible events with some of the world's greatest minds that I came here in order to listen to speak. So really, it's such an honor to get the opportunity to do that as well. So, hello, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Brittany Kaiser, and I am a data rights activist. Now, what does that mean? As you guys may be aware, data is now the world's most valuable asset. Many years ago, it was estimated that it has surpassed oil and gas. Data drives most decision-making, both internally and externally, for any organization, governmental, for-profit, or otherwise. And guess what? Most of the valuable data in the world has all been produced by us. Yet somehow, we have little to no rights to the data that we are producing. Us as producers of the world's most valuable asset, we do not have transparency as to who is collecting data on us, where it's going, where it's held, by whom, and what they're using it for, which I suppose is the most important part of this conversation. What are they using it for? We have come to a point where we are trying to decide what is our ethical and moral framework of the way that technology should develop from here forward. Because for the past decade or two, ever since the first personal devices were created, we have been giving away all of our most private information to companies that have then sold it on and created what is now a multi-trillion-dollar-a-year industry, selling our privacy for convenience of a device. Now, I never really used to see some of the questions about data and technology in this particular way. In fact, when I was first introduced to using technology and using data, it was shown to me to be one of the tools that could really change the world in a positive way, where we could use data in order to better understand how we could fix some of the world's most important problems, how we could get people to care about politics. I was 19 years old when I joined Barack Obama's first presidential campaign. I'd spent many years before that volunteering for the DNC, Howard Dean, John Kerry, and learning about how the beginning of digital was affecting politics, what people cared about, how we could get them to show up to environmental rallies, how we could get people to recruit their friends and family to vote for the first time and to actually show up to the polls. And as anyone in here that has ever engaged in activism knows, it's really hard sometimes to get people to care about the issues that you find most important, to get people to spend their time trying to change the world for the positive, as opposed to just getting on with what their daily lives already contain, full of busy things, academia, their jobs, their families, but to take their extra time to care about something that would make a huge societal impact. So on the Obama campaign, I was really shown how data could do all of these incredible things. And while I was studying in the United Kingdom, like yourselves, I spent a lot of my time volunteering for nonprofit organizations, human rights NGOs, where, again, I got to see that if you used data in communications, you could not only use your very small budget in order to have a massive impact, but you could actually measure change. You could see how many people actually cared about your issue, how many people were engaging with your message. And you could actually get them to go out and take action, get them to call their legislators, show up for a rally, and you could actually see change being made, new laws being passed, people's rights being protected. Now, while I was writing my PhD on preventive diplomacy, a concept that means how can world leaders intervene in situations before something bad happens. So instead of cleaning up after war, after a situation of mass violence, how do you get early enough information to stop this before it happens? Now, in my third year, I realized that this question was mostly about data. What data sets existed around the world, especially on social media, and what indicators were there within that data where you could analyze it and actually predict mass violence, war crimes, crimes against humanity before they happened. So that, for instance, Barack Obama could call Bashar al-Assad and say, hey, there's a red line and we're going to act because we see something coming and we don't want it to happen. And no one at my law school could teach me about that. So I joined a company called the SCL Group, Strategic Communication Laboratories, the company that was the parent group of Cambridge Analytica, because that's what they were doing on the defense side. They were actually at the time working with all allied NATO militaries in order to help them identify young people in the United Kingdom who were vulnerable to being recruited into ISIS. And these kids were receiving communications, mostly on social media, that were trying to recruit them to sneak themselves into Syria. So they were using data in order to find people that they could help and help them convince these kids to stay at home safe with their families. I thought, hey, this is really the kind of stuff that I want to learn how to do, so sign me up, I'm in. And within my first few years at that company, I learned a lot more about data than I bargained for. I learned that this industry actually allows all of our most personal information, but not just, our name and where we live, but what we buy, every single place that we go. If we're reading an article, how long we spend staring at one of the images, what we click through to, how many accounts we have, who our friends are. Every single thing that you do is being recorded, especially if you keep a smartphone in your pocket everywhere you go. Now, can I get a brief show of hands of anyone who has recently read the terms and conditions of an app that you downloaded? Yeah, I thought so. So every single app that you download on your phone comes with a contract. So does now most of the websites that you are visiting. And when you click accept cookies, which is a nice word for spyware, or when you decide to say yes to an app without reading it, you're actually signing a contract without knowing what you're signing. I'm sure most people here have never flipped to the end of a paper contract that you've received physically on your desk and just signed something away without knowing what you're giving away. But that's what we're doing sometimes hundreds of times a day, all of us. And we don't understand what that means. But if you think about it and you actually read it for once, you would say, okay, well, this random company where I heard that this app is really interesting, fun, cool. This company, I don't know who they are or where they're based or what their intentions are, and I'm going to give them access to all of my text messages, all of my contacts, all of my photos, permission to turn on my camera and my microphone 24/7 whenever they want, to track my location everywhere I go, even when I'm not in the app. Would you just give that away to anybody? Because I'm pretty sure that you have done that tens or hundreds or thousands of times over, very recently. So that's something that unfortunately is one of our societal problems, where we are not digitally literate. We're taught how to read, and now we're taught how to type and to use devices, but we're not told that everything you type, once you learn how to use that keyboard, is being recorded and bought and sold and traded around the world to anybody for any reason, no matter what they would like to use it for. And what I saw at Cambridge Analytica is that you can use data for some amazing things, and you can use data for some very tragic things. Things that we as a society have, in general, already decided we do not accept. So yes, we have a lot of new moral and ethical questions to think about emerging technologies that perhaps we haven't had enough time to debate. And that's why our legislative and regulatory framework does not fully reflect the way that we feel about those tools just yet. But there are some fundamental ethical and moral questions we've already answered for ourselves. We have all decided, especially in this country and my own, that you cannot slander or libel somebody. You cannot suppress somebody's vote. You cannot incite violence or racial hatred upon others. Yet somehow the world's most valuable, popular, biggest communications and advertising platform in the world has decided that if a politician wants to do those things, that it is newsworthy. And therefore, we're not going to enforce the laws and social norms we already have and protect that as freedom of speech. That's not freedom of speech, in fact. I'm sure many of you have studied that rigorously. Freedom of speech, my freedom of speech, ends where your human rights begin. So allowing politicians to break laws and societal norms, but we are all held to community standards is a question that we're really going to have to grapple with, and I think Americans especially are going to have a lot of questions about over the coming 11 months up until our election. And in this country, we saw huge issues with it in the election that was just passed. Unfortunately, we saw a lot of fake news and disinformation reports that were coming out of political advertising and campaigns here. Now, this is not a partisan question. This is a question that no matter what your political, religious, ideological beliefs happen to be, I think we can all agree that there are certain things that new forms of technology should not be used for. How do we enforce that? There's a few ways. One is for us to become digitally literate as individuals. Obviously, it's great to hope that big tech companies start making ethical and moral decisions and that our governments find a way to enforce new data protection and privacy laws. But we also need the tools to protect ourselves. There is a new global standard that just started to be taught in schools this year called DQ, like IQ or EQ. It's a digital intelligence quotient. And it's for all of us to start to understand what our data rights are and how to enforce them. Basic cybersecurity protocols so we can protect our privacy if we'd like, or at least use technology in a way where we understand what we're sharing or not. Media literacy, so that we can spot fake news and disinformation and decide for ourselves what is real and what is being paid for to persuade us. Teaching kids how to protect themselves from cyberbullying, or I suppose anybody could use a bit more knowledge about that. How to use technology ethically. How do you remain ethical on social media even if you want to remain anonymous? How do you limit your screen time so you actually protect your own mental and emotional state? So there's a lot more to come on that front, but education and digital literacy is so important. Most secondly would be for our governments to actually put together the legislative and regulatory frameworks we need to protect ourselves and to force technology companies, which unfortunately these days every company is a technology company. If you're not using data to drive your decision making, you're probably not doing it right. So if every company is touching data, everyone needs to be forced to make the moral decision about how to use data, and that needs to be enshrined in new laws or in laws that we already have that need better enforcement. And the third is to obviously start to use technology to protect our privacy or to at least give us transparency and consent so we can decide what we want to share or not, because it's very possible that we are going into this incredible future where data science and artificial intelligence can help us solve a lot of the world's greatest problems. I never would have joined a company like Cambridge Analytica if I didn't see the potential for that future. And so if we want to have a future where, for instance, I can anonymously share my medical data with every research and pharma company in the world so that I can contribute to making sure that cancer doesn't exist on planet Earth, then I should be able to do that and know that my data will be treated safely and I know where it's going and who's using it, right? So we need to answer these fundamental questions first before we can start to think about what that future might look like and what we're comfortable with. So thank you guys for having me. I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions, so I'll leave it at that. But I really appreciate you guys caring about these issues, showing up this evening, showing up for me and for yourselves, because I really think that this issue is going to define our generation, and it's going to define the next few years, whether we fight hard enough to protect our privacy, to protect what our data rights should be, or we continue to let the kleptocracy that our current system has turned into to proliferate. You know, it's our choice right now. Each and every one of you can call your legislator and tell them that you actually want to see data protection enforcement. Remember, they work for us. We voted them in. If you've ever had staff or team members and you don't tell them what to do every day, I would be surprised. So call your legislator. It's really easy if you've never done it before. There are very simple instructions on the parliamentary website. So thanks again, and I really hope that all of you guys care about these issues and want to get involved. If you want to know more, I started the Own Your Data Foundation recently, and I have tons of opportunities to explain to you how you can actually get more involved in these campaigns. So I welcome you to join this movement if you haven't already. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us here today. I wanted to start by asking about your role in Cambridge Analytica. Could you give us your personal account of the company's misuse of data and the Brexit referendum and the 2016 US election, and what your role was in the company during this time?
Yeah, of course. So I was the director of business development, which is a fancy way of saying I worked in sales. I had my role to go and meet with all of the potential or current clients of the company, which were a lot of times presidents, prime ministers, or people that wanted to be. Also the heads of companies that were doing brand advertising campaigns, and to work with them to design a data program of how Cambridge Analytica could assist them in using the data they already had, adding more data, doing research in order to achieve whatever their goals happened to be, whether it was winning an election, or for a nonprofit, finding more donors, or selling a different brand of toothpaste. It's whatever they needed to do that Cambridge could help them with. So on both the referendum in the United Kingdom as well as the 2016 election, I met with many people on both sides, on different campaigns that were involved in order to design some of these programs, right? So in Brexit specifically, apparently I was not in this meeting, apparently we pitched the Remain side first, and we were told that they did not need to hire expensive political consultants because they were going to win anyway. And so then Steve Bannon, who at the time was on the board of Cambridge Analytica, introduced us to Vote Leave and the Leave EU campaign. And in my first meeting, I was in the Leave EU campaign, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of those characters. And they said that they wanted to use different data sets, not just from their own campaign, but also from the UKIP political party and from some of their commercial companies, in order to have as much data as possible to model the population in the United Kingdom and figure out who wanted to remain, who wanted to leave, and if you wanted to leave, why, and could you get involved in their campaign and actually register and turn out to vote. That still remains, for some people, I suppose, a massive question of whether or not that work was done, but for me, It's not a question because I was there and the work was done. Now, both sides, both of the campaigns involved in the Leave side used very sophisticated data-driven techniques in order to find people who wanted to leave the EU and mobilize them to get involved in the campaign. Now, we were not, as a company, involved in anything past the beginning stages. But what we saw in the months after I was back in the United States and working over there was that both Vote Leave and Leave EU had pretty much a disregard for moral standards and the communications that they were putting out. There was significant amounts of disinformation and fake news that was used in order to target people, and a lot of fear-based messaging. The fear-based messaging, in my opinion, is almost more offensive in the ways that they use that. And you started to see that very obviously in the Trump campaign in the United States as well. So again, on that side, I was involved in the beginning pitches and designing what Cambridge Analytica would do for Donald Trump. Originally, it was a pitch, as I was told, to allow Donald Trump to test his messaging on the entire United States so that after the election campaign, which we all assumed he would lose, that he would be able to make a new billion-dollar company, a network called Trump TV. So we had to collect as much data as possible so that we could use that for Trump TV to eventually get viewership. That's not what it turned out to be, obviously, in the end. And I didn't work on the campaign or any of the super PACs itself, but I, as a member of the company, was given a 2-day-long debrief a month after Donald Trump did win the election to show, for the people who did run the campaign, to show us what they did. One of the first things that they showed us was how they modeled voters. And they showed us this chart, actually, in my book, Targeted. I put in a lot of these charts and examples so that people can really see what this is. But they modeled people on an X and Y axis. So every voter in the United States was modeled on how likely you are to vote or not on one axis, and how likely you are to care about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump as your favorable candidate. Now, if you were on the side of Hillary Clinton and you were in the middle of likely to vote or not, you would be considered what's called persuadable, which means that you are persuadable not to vote for Donald Trump because you're all the way on the Hillary side, but you could be persuadable to not vote at all. I don't know how you would call that anything else besides a voter suppression strategy when they circled this group of people and called that group deterrence, to deter people from voting and engaging with Hillary Clinton's campaign. And we were shown that, and not just that group, but some of the messaging that they sent to those people. Within that group, there were people of different racial, gender, ethnic backgrounds, and for certain groups, they made those people feel like Hillary Clinton could never protect their rights, or even had incredibly negative feelings about those groups. For conservative women, they sent out messaging that made it seem like Hillary wasn't a good woman because she stayed with a husband who cheated on her. I mean, the insidious tactics that were used were incredibly concerning. And I left the New York office the next day.
So can you give us a bit of insight into the meetings where you decided to work with Leave EU and with Trump in the US presidential campaign? Because you mentioned that you come from a background of human rights. Did you ever voice opposition to working with Aaron Banks and Steve Bannon? And how did that turn out?
Yeah, looking back on it, it's not great to have even had to have been in the same room with some of those people. But in the beginning, which I'm sure a lot of people here will feel in their first jobs, or if you have already had them, you'll feel that when you're sat in a room with very powerful people, you're more there to kind of listen and to learn what's going on. And I was there to kind of pitch a product, I suppose, to people and then leave and not actually take part in a campaign that I definitely thought would be minuscule, a campaign where I thought these people are never going to win. So being in the room with them was more observatory to me in the beginning. I didn't actually think that we would be carrying much out for them or that many people would even support them. I suppose that's the problem with personal bias. I actually didn't think it was possible for these people to win. I didn't think it was possible for them to win anyone's hearts and minds because they're not exactly inspiring individuals. And the way that they speak about their voters, the way that they speak about the human beings that live in their societies is incredibly offensive. So I just didn't think that people like that could ever really rise to power in a society that I had a lot of confidence that we had gotten past that. That racism is no longer okay and hasn't been for a very long time, that you do not create messaging of xenophobia, that we are open societies. There are so many things that came out of those campaigns that I spent so much of my life fighting against. So it's very emotional to look back and actually see that those people did gain traction and they gained ground and they gained support and they used data-driven tactics to do that, and that the wool was pulled over too many people's eyes, unfortunately.
You were with Cambridge Analytica for 3 years before speaking out. When was the moment that you realized their misuse of data, and following on from that, what sparked the decision to come out publicly?
Right, so a few months before I quit was around the time where I was really fighting with my company about having a data protection team and about giving me access to as many lawyers as I wanted access to. I would call them and say, hey, we want to do a project in this country we've never worked in before. What are we allowed to do with data there? Can you match political data to commercial data? What models can you use? Do you have to model it within the country, or can the data be actually used by data scientists at our headquarters in London, for instance? And every time the invoice would come in from the lawyers, then my executives would have a very stern talking to with me about how I was creating too many invoices and we had enough expertise in-house about how to use data. The only expertise we had in-house were data scientists, not lawyers, right? So I begged and begged and begged, can we please get a data protection officer? I need someone to make these decisions for me. I am not a lawyer that works on contract law or data law. Someone else needs to be making these decisions. I can't build a database or a project here without this assistance. And eventually, that was one of the main reasons why I quit, before I actually had any understanding that they were keeping a Facebook data set that they weren't supposed to have, any of that. And when I started to see reports coming out of the United Kingdom that actually the work that we had done in the Brexit referendum had never been registered by anybody, that brought up quite a few more questions than I expected to have. And realizing that both electoral spending laws and data protection laws in the United Kingdom had likely been contravened, and I started to see more and more of the actual communications and advertising that had been used in the Trump campaign, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. So I left many months before everything blows up in the press, that all of a sudden there is this Facebook data set that Cambridge Analytica told Facebook they deleted years before, and apparently they didn't. So the moment I found that out was when I said, well, there's a lot more to the story than just a Facebook data set, and I really hope that everyone can see that, but they're not going to see anything besides just a problem with Facebook's negligence unless I come out and actually show them what else data was being used for, because it wasn't just a Facebook data set. It was a lot more than that. And I flew, the day after I found out about that, I flew to San Francisco to work with the San Francisco bureau chief of The Guardian, Paul Lewis, to start to go through the documents that I had kept from my work computer and find out, okay, well, what else is there here? Because there's a much bigger story than a Facebook data set. It's about powerful people misusing technology. It's about our lack of data rights. And it's about how easily our democracies are sold to the highest bidder because of the data infrastructure and what's actually available to buy, and how vulnerable we are, and how we don't really have consent into what goes on.
And you came out as a whistleblower a week after Christopher Wiley did. Did you work with him at all during your time at Cambridge Analytica, and how did him speaking out influence, if it did at all, you coming out?
Absolutely. So surprisingly, Chris and I have never met. Actually, he left the company in 2014 before I joined. So we were on one kind of handover phone call together once in the beginning of 2015, but no, we've never met in person. So it was quite a surprise to me, well, I guess in some ways, when he came out and said, okay, well, I was the person that collected this Facebook data and the company never deleted it. It's like, oh, really? If they didn't delete that Facebook data set because I was copied on the emails where they said they did, you know, what else were they hiding from me and people in the company, and what else, if we really dig into it, is quite a big problem with the way that that company was run. So when he came out and said that, it was the first time where, instead of me just separating myself from the company and trying to move on with my life, that I started to say, I think I now have a responsibility to do something a lot more than that, because this guy has done something very important and brought up a really important issue, but he wasn't at the company during the Brexit and Trump campaigns, and therefore doesn't have access to what I had. And it is now my duty to make sure that people understand the entirety of the story and how big of a problem this actually is. So although it was the scariest decision I've ever made in my life, I was inspired what he did in order to go out and do the same.
You said in an interview last week that Cambridge Analytica data is still being used. Can you expand a bit on this comment and tell us how and where? Yeah, absolutely. So currently the Cambridge Analytica database is with the Information Commissioner's Office in the United Kingdom, and they still haven't released the report on what it contains or what happened in the 2016 elections. So a lot of us that spent a lot of our, so much of our time testifying and working with legislators and investigators to try to bring this story to light are, you know, vastly disappointed that the regulators have been so slow. So we can't even tell you all of what was on there, but from my understanding of what was on there, all of the data that Cambridge Analytica had is still available for purchase and license by anyone that has the money to do it. And most of the people that are causing a lot of damage in terms of political communications definitely have the money to buy it. You know, none of our data protection laws have changed the amount of data that is still available for purchase about us. Even in the United Kingdom, you can go to Experian, you can buy a data set that is on everybody here above the age of 18 and contains hundreds or thousands of data points about you, and you can upload that into Facebook, where Facebook usually gives you 80 to 90% one-to-one matching, and then I can serve communications directly to you off of that. You can do that in the US, in the UK, and now I think many other countries actually one-to-one on Facebook. So none of what's in GDPR or in the California Consumer Privacy Act stops the whole data industry from functioning in exactly the same way. It stops campaigns from in Europe being able to endlessly use your data to communicate with you. You have to get opt-in from people in order to send them certain political communications over here. But as we've seen with foreign intervention in elections, you know, there are people that care about obeying electoral law, and then there are people that will always find a way to get
dirty money into politics and not obey electoral spending laws or the ethics and standards that we have set up in Western democracies. So, you know, the data sets from Experian to Axiom to Info Group, Magellan, Labels and Lists, and then all of the online data companies like Rocket Fuel, Load2Me, and then matching those into Facebook. I mean, all of that's still there. Nothing's changed a bit.
Do you think that the use or misuse of data in the upcoming US election will be even worse than in 2016, and how so?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think what we see this year is going to be harrowing. I really wish that we would have been able to take the opportunity over the past few years to stop this from getting worse before it gets better, but unfortunately I don't believe that that's what is going on, because a certain someone called Mark Zuckerberg has decided that everything that politicians say is newsworthy and that they will not be managing any political content, not fact-checking. So that leaves a big gaping hole in our ability to protect ourselves in election time. And until Facebook is forcefully regulated, I believe that they will always make decisions on profit-based motives, not on protecting their users, which is why legislators and regulators need to try a lot harder. You know, Mark Zuckerberg is still in contempt of Parliament, yet the amount of money that politicians here are still spending on his platform is, you know, it's the majority of every advertising and communications budget that exists. So.
And my final question before moving on to the audience is going back to the 2016 US elections. Mm-hmm. Did you ever have the opportunity to bring up any concerns you had with working with the Trump campaign to Alexander Nix, and how did he respond?
So at the time, Cambridge Analytica was trying to work with as many clients as possible. At the time, it's kind of like the Democrats this time around. There were 17 different Republican candidates that were running, and we worked on, I mean, I must have pitched at least 12 of them for their work, again, never thinking that any of them had the opportunity to win against Hillary Clinton. And so when we got to the Trump campaign, it wasn't until he was actually the nominee. So when he was the nominee, by that time, there was a group of people working in the United States that joined his campaign, people from Cambridge Analytica that moved to San Antonio to work with Brad Parscale, and some of them stayed in New York working for Trump Tower. And I was not excited about doing that at all. I especially was quite upset about the you know, the racist rhetoric that came out of Donald Trump, especially about all of my Mexican friends. So I actually moved to Mexico because I refused to work on the campaign. And I started Cambridge Analytica Mexico during that time so that I could be there in that country reassuring my friends that I did not believe in what one of my company's clients was saying on television, and that I wanted to work with them and wanted to be there. So I did, at the time, the best that I could, given that I was not in a position to be able to switch jobs at that time. So you know, looking back on it, it would have been nice to go somewhere else at that time and not be there. Or what I truly regret is not having enough information at the time to become a whistleblower before November 8th, 2016. But I didn't know enough yet. You can't always see everything. You know, hindsight is 20/20.
Thank you. We'll move on to questions from the audience now. Please raise your hand if you have a question, wait for the microphone to come to you, and then stand up to ask your question. And please keep your hand raised once you're picked. Could we go to the hand over there in the middle? Yeah, with the blonde hair? Yeah, could you stand up?
Yeah, so I was just wondering how much access do these companies have to really personal data like our photos, text messages, and can they access your microphone?
So it depends what permissions you have given in app. You know, Facebook says that they don't access your microphone anymore, although they used to. But right now, it's really hard to understand all of the terms and conditions, even if you do take the time to read them. They'll phrase it in what's called legalese, so complex legal speak that's made to confuse you so you don't actually know what you're agreeing to in the first place. But if you don't read them, then you definitely won't know what you're agreeing to. I would say, at least half the apps on your phone, you probably give 24/7 access to your microphone for them to turn on whenever they want. And you might tell yourself that that is just so that, because it's a chat app and you need access to a microphone in order to use the service properly. But if you think about what else that could be used for, which is actually to spy on you all of the time, every day, then you need to decide whether that app is right for you. Do you trust the people that run that company? Do you even know who they are? Maybe not. So these are questions we should be asking ourselves more often than we do today, because as we saw with the show of hands earlier, no one's really asking themselves this question.
Do they have access to like photographs? Or do they have access to photographs and text messages?
Yes, I would say just as many that access your microphone will ask for permission for that, absolutely. I mean, but it depends. A lot of apps, because you can send photographs in that app or use them or post them, then they always have access to your photo album or what have you. Maybe not always your camera, it depends, but you have to look. I mean, I would assume that at least half the apps on your phone have access to all of those things. Yeah.
Could we go to the member in the back with the gray sweater? Could you stand up, please? Thank you. Can you wait for the microphone? Thank you.
You've portrayed yourself this evening as like an activist, and you've described yourself as a whistleblower, but several internal emails that have come out sort of give the impression that you were quite instrumental in securing the campaigns and a key figure within Cambridge Analytica. Do you not think it's fair to say that you bear a significant responsibility for the damage that has been done?
Absolutely. That's one of the hardest things about being a whistleblower, is that you have to have something to whistleblow on that you were involved with. So
it could be argued that if you're such a large part of what has been implementing the damage, that you're no longer a whistleblower so much as someone that's trying to jump ship.
Well, a whistleblower means that you bring new and original information to the public, to journalists, to investigators. I've brought over 100,000 documents and spent most of the past 2 years basically being a pro bono expert witness in order to help legislators, regulators, investigators, and the public understand what happened. It's never too late to do the right thing, and when you realize that something you're doing is not what you want to be involved with, and that actually you don't think anyone should be involved in using technology in that way, then you have a decision to make. I now spend nearly all of my time doing pro bono work to solve these problems so that it no longer happens. I wasn't on some of those campaigns, but I definitely was there pitching, involved, and I stayed in the company. And so that is something that weighs on my chest every day, but I can't change the past. I can only change what happens in the future, and there is a lot of work to be done. So it's definitely all hands on deck. I mean, I work right now with a lot of former Facebook people, former Google, a lot of people that have left their companies due to ethical concerns. Some of them wouldn't consider themselves whistleblowers per se because they were not releasing documents and working with investigators, but they work on, the ethics or health implications of technology. They testify a lot in Congress alongside me, helping craft some of the new data protection and privacy laws, especially in the United States. We advise other countries on how to do that as well, and also work with companies in order to understand how to better protect data and what are the loopholes in our laws, because obviously we have GDPR here, and a lot of other countries actually do have laws to protect people, but there are unfortunately too many ways to get around that, and too many ways where those laws are difficult to enforce. So it's only people that have worked in companies that have seen how technology is abused that can use our primary source information to say, these are all of the ways that we can stop this from happening again.
Could we go to the hand over there in the...
Hello, thanks for coming. I was wondering, you've described a whole lot about what is problematic about the big social media companies that we are participating and using nowadays. Have you seen companies that have made a step forward that you could recommend in a way where you think they do it the right way? And how do you think does their profit model look like? Because a big pushback always is, oh, we have to finance ourselves, and the way we finance ourselves is through advertising, so we need to use this data. So what would you say to that?
Right. So again, I don't think it's a problem with the tools or perhaps even data-driven advertising systems. I see those as benign in most cases. It's who's using them and how and for what, where we need to work on protecting against bad actors. Obviously, there are some companies that have designed their entire platform for privacy or at least data transparency and consensual opt-in mechanisms, or even rewarding you for sharing your data, which I very much believe in. So for example, you could use Signal instead of WhatsApp. You could use Brave browser, DuckDuckGo instead of Google Chrome. There are daily decisions that you can make where you know that the company has built this platform in order to protect you, and that on some of them, if you do want to share data, you can. Others are specifically made so that it's basically impossible for anyone to ever get access to your data, and that's a decision that you would have to make for yourself. Brave browser rewards you for your searches, and they don't share data with companies, but you contributing towards their search algorithms, you get paid to do that, right? DuckDuckGo is more specific, privacy-based. So there's a lot of new options coming out. There are even Facebook, Twitter rivals that are coming out. I think Jack Dorsey is at least paying lip service to wanting to do the right thing, and that Twitter might become a better platform than it is today. But I don't see Facebook trying to make the right decision. So I see a lot more Facebook competitors that are coming out. The founder of Craigslist just created a new one, which is interesting. There's another one coming out called Voice that is blockchain based, where you own your data and you're paid for the content that you create within the platform, as opposed to Facebook owning everything that you ever post, which they do, just so you know. They have rights to everything that you've ever posted. So that's it's a strong consideration that Facebook is never going to go away, but there are going to become other options. I myself still use Facebook, shockingly, but it's because I believe that it could be a tool for good. I don't want it to go away. I just want them to stop abusing people. So we'll see how that goes. But I spend a lot of time with regulators hoping that there will be legislative frameworks that will encourage, as a business model, that if you give people transparency and privacy, that you can do well as a company, that it will actually be a benefit and a perk and something that people are more interested in than companies that have shown to not do the right thing.
Could we go to the hand on the first row?
I'll apologize in advance, it's a bit of a pessimistic question, but you said yourself that the data industry has got so big and comparable to industries like big pharma and big oil because of the massive capital interest in it. Greenpeace was founded in 1971, they haven't made a lot of progress in those 49 years. Do you think this fight is actually going to be any different for our generation?
I do see this as completely different, but in a also equally pessimistic way, all of us here, we can't get our privacy back in terms of the data that we've already produced. That data is out there in millions, perhaps, databases around the world, and we cannot go anywhere and expect the right to delete. That's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about protecting all the data that we create here into the future, so that our children and grandchildren are not put in the same situation as us. And so right now, we have the ability to not just create a legislative and regulatory framework that will protect us, but also invest in increasing compliance and making it easier for us to have that transparency. And annoyingly, that's actually a lot more investment in technology, because as good as the law might be, I cannot protect my data if I can't actually prove on the back end that my data has gone certain places or not, that my data has been deleted if I've asked for the right to delete. Those are technology solutions, which is why I'm such a fan of distributed ledger technology and blockchain, where things can't be erased and you have tracking and traceability of where everything goes. But this fight is fundamental on many levels, which is that we're talking about whether or not data rights should be as important to us as human rights, so that we are born with the respect under governmental frameworks that we will always have access to our data and a choice of where it goes. The other big debate, which I am a huge proponent of, is whether our data is our property. And in multiple states, I've already helped pass laws where our data is our intangible personal property. So we have rights to it the same way we have rights to our other property, like our house or our car. And so where I see the future of this going is already proven to be a very successful business model, which is, say, Airbnb, right? If someone wants to use your property on Airbnb, your house, they tell you who they are, what they want to use it for how long, and you agree on a price before you hand away the keys. So the future of data ownership and data protection and privacy should look like that. Because, as I said, I'm not a privacy advocate where I think we should all never share data ever again. That's not what the future looks like. The future is driven by AI and data science, so that most of the world's problems can be solved without humans actually needing to be involved in all of that decision making. And that comes from us having a fundamental right to protect the data that we have and share it on a consensual basis. A lot of people in this movement even talk about, universal basic income, universal earned income. I like the earned income conversation because we are all so valuable as individuals, as human beings, that the amount of data that we create every day would be enough to feed ourselves if we were data inputs to all of the places where our data could be monetized. So there's not a fundamental change in business model that needs to happen. So much money is already earned from our data. It's just recognizing that we should have some ownership rights on that and get a dividend from that and be able to have transparency or at least consent as to whether or not we want to participate in that system.
Could we go to the hand over there in the black?
Hi, thank you for speaking. So you're currently involved with a company called Funware, am I saying that right? So, but they're
Can you say that one more time, sorry?
Funware, I'm not sure how you say it. You've been appointed to the advisory board?
Yeah, no, I don't work with them, and I never have. I was negotiating to do so, because they were the first big data company that ever told me they wanted to give all of the data that they had back to the individuals that it came from. So they pitched me on saying, okay, well, we're going to give everyone their data back. Everyone's going to have an app where they can see all the data that we hold on them. They can decide whether they want to delete it or continue to have us monetize it, and they'll get a cut of every advertiser that we work with. And I thought, wow, this is hopefully one of many companies to come that will decide that this is the right thing to do. And unfortunately, while I was negotiating to work with them, they started working for the Trump campaign. So I had to withdraw from that. Obviously, I think a lot of big companies are working with both sides of the aisle, but I am not interested in ever touching that one again. But it's important to talk about what that model would look like, because I also want to address this question again, which is what is the practicality of data ownership, and is this a losing battle, or do we actually have a chance here? And anyone here that knows anything about data science, you will know a few fundamental things, which is that purchasing and licensing data about people and then matching it and hygiening it, which basically means, for instance, if someone buys 5 data sets about me and 3 of them say I'm a woman and 2 of them say I'm a man, there's going to be a lot of time and money spent by PhD holding data scientists building an algorithm to predict whether I'm a man or a woman. Where if you actually gave me an app where I could see all the data you held on me and you incentivized me or paid me to update it, I could very easily tell you I am a woman. I identify as a woman and I am a woman. And I would also maybe be willing to tell you what I had for breakfast if you wanted to give me 25% off at the restaurant you're trying to advertise to get me to go eat at, right? So there's a way that we can make data science a lot more efficient and ethical at the same time, where companies don't have to waste all of their money buying data about us and could actually just ask us for our data directly. And we could be the ones that benefit from that instead of these companies like Equifax and Experian that seem to not be able to protect our data and not be good custodians of our assets. And then you could use PhD holding data scientists to solve real problems besides trying to figure out if I still live in Chicago, Illinois, which I haven't in many years, but a lot of data sets say that I still live there because I grew up there in my parents' house. And they would actually be able to direct very intelligent students that have done, so many degrees already to do something better than just data hygiene. So the fundamental way that data science works right now is incredibly inefficient, very time consuming and very expensive, which is why companies like Cambridge Analytica exist, because companies need help going through that process and can't usually hire all of that expertise in-house. So if you're not a very technical person, that conversation might be the first time you've ever thought about that. But if you've ever worked with data, you will know that it's fundamentally very inefficient, and we have a huge opportunity to make that better. And becoming more ethical and transparent and rewarding people for wanting to share their data is definitely a big option for that.
We have time for one last question. Could we go to the hand in the second row?
Hello. So my question is regarding the most recent general election in the UK. I was wondering what your opinion was on the massive Conservative win and whether all this data has been used yet again in perhaps a more efficient way than it was at the EU referendum and the 2016 US election.
Yeah, of course. So the same people were involved in this past election as were involved in the Brexit election, and a lot of the Brexiteers, so to say, that started using data science in 2015 to identify everyone in this country who was pro-leave. They have most likely maintained the same databases and the same program since 2015, which is again why the old Trump team that's still running Trump's 2020 election are in the same position. If you've been building a database since 2015 and all of the algorithms are constantly learning and becoming more accurate and obtaining more data, that just allows them to be much more powerful than someone that has just started a new campaign and has just started, with their social media followings or with buying data. So I could really tell from all of the reports that I received from people that that what happened in the last election here, there was very precise use of micro-targeting, and they definitely had databases that for years were identifying who was most vulnerable to certain messaging. That's the problem with micro-targeting and why a lot of platforms are either banning political advertising while they figure out how to deal with the problems, or they're testing the banning of micro-targeting, not just political ads, but just micro-targeting, because if somebody is vulnerable to fear-based messaging about immigrants and the database knows that, then they're going to be hit with, I mean, some of the really shocking messaging that you might have seen, and alternative facts that are not true about people who are coming to contribute to this country. I myself have been an immigrant in the UK for 14 years, so a lot of that messaging is really hurtful. And so I really think that that there's a lot to be done in terms of enforcing electoral law online here in this country, especially the beginning of the Information Commissioner's report out of 2016. Their basic first conclusions were that our electoral laws are not fit for purpose. They're not. Again, when I gave that voter suppression example before, people are used to saying it's voter suppression if you lie to people about where the voting booth is or how many hours it's open. That's not voter suppression anymore. It's finding people who might not decide to vote if they don't believe in their government anymore, they don't believe in their candidate. So I think that enforcing our electoral laws that we already have online is a problem, let alone probably some of the new ones we need to write, which is why I spend all of my time with legislators and regulators right now, but also what time I have left. I work on digital literacy education, so people start to wake up and realize when you are being micro-targeted so that you can identify what fake news and disinformation looks like. Because in the end, we're going to have to equip ourselves with these skills while the laws and enforcement actually catches up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but please join me in thanking Brittany for being here today.